NBC Sunday.
In the primary, voters will consider two referendum questions that could affect how elections are run in Wisconsin. One asks voters whether private funds should be used to conduct elections. The other deals with the role of election officials. Political reporter Darielle Fair has more.
Here with me now, I have Wisconsin Common Cause Executive Director Jay Heck and Will Flanders, Research Director for the Wisconsin Institute of Law and Liberty. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us. Thank you.
As Sarah just laid out, referendum question 1 deals with grant funding in elections. Will, we'll start with you. Can you talk a little bit about the process that went into having these constitutional amendments put on the ballot and what the issue is here?
Sure. So in order for an amendment to be on the ballot, it has to pass the legislature 2 consecutive sessions. And that was done, and now it's on the ballot for the spring election. The key question here is whether or not we want private funding from outside interests. So, for example, someone like Mark Zuckerberg or someone on the right, like the NRA or Elon Musk, actually funding directly election administration. We saw that during the 2020 election. A lot of us out there think that's something we shouldn't see continue, and this amendment would bring that to an end. There's a second amendment we can discuss subsequently as well that's also related.
And Jay, can you talk about how those funds were used in the 2020 election and the concerns that some organizations may have if these referendums pass?
Well, the funds were used in a nonpartisan manner to help election clerks and municipalities all over Wisconsin to be able to conduct safe elections. Remember, it was during the pandemic, and the Wisconsin legislature, controlled by the Republicans, did not appropriate sufficient funds to be able to supply clerks with all the resources they needed in order to be able to conduct safe elections. And the money was used for things like safe equipment, masks, but also things like to hire poll workers, people that they needed to work at polling places so that voters of the left or the right in blue counties and red wouldn't have to wait in line and they could vote safely. So the money, had it been appropriated by the Wisconsin legislature, there wouldn't have been a need for this private money, but it would be a mistake to outlaw it unless the Wisconsin legislature works with the governor to appropriate sufficient money to conduct elections safely.
Will, your organization and also Republican lawmakers have argued that these funds were disproportionately allocated during the 2020 election. Can you explain why? And then also, can you talk about can you talk a little bit about whether you think that this money impacted the outcome of the 2020 election?
Yeah, so what we see in the with the CTCL funding, that was the Center for Tech and Civic Life, that was the major source for these funds. What we saw was that the funds went disproportionately to Democratic-leaning communities in the state. Now, folks that are defending CTCL will say any city that applied for the grant could have it, and that's actually true. But I think what we see here is really a dangerous precedent. Without this constitutional amendment passing, we could have an outside funder come in and only, exclusively fund elections in, say, conservative-leaning parts of the state or liberal parts of the state. So now that the precedent is established, even if you think CTCL acted objectively, we think that there's a chance for more negative things happening in the future. When Jay mentions, the need for more public funding, I think that's something worthy of discussing, right? If we're going to pass this amendment, I think the door is open to have discussions about whether more public funding is needed. I will say there were communities like Oshkosh that didn't get any CTCL funding. It's still a sizable community in Wisconsin. Nonetheless, we're able to conduct their elections without this funding coming in. So while there is need to sort of look at those options, it's worth considering the need for more public funding going forward.
And to your point, Will, as Will just stated, there's a conversation around these funds posing a threat to election integrity. Do you have a response to that, Jay?
Well, again, these funds were not used for anything other than to administer elections safely. They didn't support one side or the other. The fact that there were larger cities in Wisconsin that received more money makes sense because that's where the population centers of Wisconsin are. And those happen to be perhaps more democratic in urban areas. But again, any rural area that applied for the money was able to receive it. So again, I think in the best of worlds, it would be better not to have private money, but I think it would be a mistake to outlaw it unless we have sufficient resources that will be coming from the legislature and the governor. And by the way, I'm hoping now that we have an end to the gerrymandered maps in Wisconsin that we'll see more bipartisan cooperation and more agreement on things like safe election administration.
And now, guys, I want to shift to referendum question 2, addressing who can administer the state's elections. Jay, should voters be concerned about the current language in Wisconsin's Constitution? And is it too broad, or is introducing a constitutional amendment like this, would that make that language too restrictive?
Well, I think this language is so innocuous that it would raise doubts about what exactly effect it might have. I think, election clerks, local areas of jurisdiction can better make decisions about who should be working on elections in their area than partisan politicians in Madison, Wisconsin. So I think this is a decision that ought to be kept at the local level. And again, like the first question and now the second question, to amend the Wisconsin Constitution, these are both measures that failed in the Wisconsin legislative process. And this is just a way to try to circumvent the governor, circumvent the legislative process to put something into law. I don't think it's the proper way to talk about election administration. The Constitution should be something that we amend rarely, not just because you lost something and didn't get it through the legislative process.
And then I have a question for you both. You can start us off, Will. How do you think these constitutional amendments, if passed, will ultimately impact our future elections here in Wisconsin?
Yeah, so I think, we discussed a minute ago, we alluded to the concerns people have still about the 2020 election. Will, the organization, not me personally, although me personally as well, did a large report, looking at a lot of the allegations that were out there and finding a lot of them, again, not to be based on reality, but there's a sense that we need to restore faith in our democratic process. And I think by passing these 2 amendments, we'll take this issue effectively off the table. And folks that are concerned about elections will at least see that something is being done to improve our election integrity. And it's something tangible and real that can actually make an improvement and not have these out-of-state billionaires funding our elections at the same time.
And Jay?
And I would just say that there's many points of agreement that I have with Will, but this is not the way to do it. We shouldn't be amending the Constitution. What we should do is have a bipartisan solution with Republicans working with Democrats and the governor and with voting rights groups and everybody else to administer elections safely. That's in everybody's interest, whether you're from a rural red county or an urban blue county. So I think the better way to do this is to work together in a bipartisan manner and not just try to put it through in a constitutional amendment in an election that a lot of people aren't even going to really know what this question is all about.
Jay Heck, Will Flanders, thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.